Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. This is Panos Moumtzis with the Transformative Agenda team here in Geneva. I want to say a warm welcome to all participants of this discussion, this webinar of this morning, where we're going to be talking about preparedness. The focus of the preparedness conversation is on the learning that has taken place following the Nepal earthquake. So the key question I will be asking our speakers today is, what have we learned? What worked? What didn't work? What is it that all of you listening to us from different parts of the world you can take to your own work, to your own day-to-day, so that you can, as a humanitarian community, we can learn from the best practices. We can learn also from our mistakes and see how to take things forward to the next steps. We will be hearing in a minute the perspective from different members, different actors of the humanitarian community who were involved on the Nepal preparedness. We'll hear from a humanitarian coordinator. We'll hear from another organization point of view. We'll hear from donors. We'll hear from the task force. But before introducing the speakers and the topic, I'd like to first say a couple of words about the webinar. And those of you who have attended previous ones, you're familiar with it. To start with, the webinar is going to last for about 90 minutes. During the first 45 minutes, I will be asking a question or two to each of the four panelists, and basically is to introduce the topic and to hear their perspective on the lessons from the Nepal earthquake response. During the second 45 minutes, I would like to take your questions and direct them to the panelists. And so I'd like really to encourage you from the get-go to use as much as possible the questions box. I'd like to ask you to keep your microphone at all times on mute, and please put off your video camera. I actually see one of our colleagues who has a video on, so please disconnect it, because that takes bandwidth space and makes it more difficult for colleagues who are in the deep field. So please disconnect your video from the screen. As you look into your screen in front of you, there is a central part where the title of the webinar is, and that will be a PowerPoint presentation that will show some pictures and some key messages as we go through. This presentation will be sent to all participants at the end of this webinar, so you will get it all on your email. You will also see on the top right-hand side of your screen, there is three boxes: participants, chat, and Q&A. Well, the participants list, you see the names and number of people who are listening live to this conversation. The middle box, the chat box, I would suggest that you all keep this box clicked in as a priority. And I'd like to encourage you all to use the chat box to talk in between yourselves, to not hesitate, to have also a live conversation through the chat box with all of you. You can send questions, you can share your reflections, your reactions, your thoughts. Our speakers are also connected to the chat box and will intervene as we speak through the webinar. The third box to the right is the questions and answers one. And I'd like to encourage you actually from right now to use it and send us questions. If you have a question specific to your own question, to your own context, your own operation, you're challenging with part of the preparedness. You have a question that has not been covered by the speakers as we speak, or it's very specific to your own operation. Please don't hesitate to send us your questions as we go through. I will take your question and direct them to the speakers as we go through the webinar, and we will take them in the second 45 minutes, in the second half of this conversation. We'll take the webinars on the ground. I can still see some colleagues have their video camera on, so please put off your camera. So I would also like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded, and as with previous ones, we will have it online. So if there is a colleague that you would like to refer to listen or to repeat it, we can do that. Also, the webinar is downloaded live as we speak on YouTube. So if some of you are having problem connecting, we will give you, it's already there online, the YouTube connection You see it on your screen, which will improve the quality. If you're listening from a deep field connection location, this will help you. I'm encouraged to see we have colleagues listening from 29 countries at this moment and 10 donor capitals, or let's say Western Northern capitals where colleagues are listening. I'm encouraged to see also so many of you from the NGO and UN colleagues who are listening and participating to this webinar. So today's topic is really about preparedness and the Nepal earthquake, lessons learned of what we have learned from there. When we talk about preparedness, of course, preparedness is one, there is two protocols related to the transformative agenda, related to the reform effort, which talk about preparedness. We have the common framework for preparedness, which is all really what it's about building resilience with the host community in order to withstand in the best possible way any impact of disaster taking place. And the second transformative agenda protocol that was prepared related to preparedness is the emergency response preparedness. And this is a protocol that really makes reference to early warning, to contingency planning, and to other actions that need to be put in place in order to improve the coordinated response. I think we all agree preparedness is vital, is really very important. It's a huge element to be able to save lives, to be able to be prepared. Yet the struggle we always have is really to be able to ensure the relevant funding, the support is there to make it happen. To answer to all these questions, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll introduce them with the order that will be asking the questions. So I'd like to introduce Tony Gregg, who is the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Team on Preparedness and Resilience. He has been the co-chair for the last 5 years. He's a Senior Emergency Preparedness and Response Advisor with the World Food Programme. Welcome, Tony. Tony is with me here in Geneva. I'd also like to introduce Victoria Stodart. Victoria is a senior officer. She's with the Shelter and Settlement cluster, and she's based with the International Federation of the Red Cross. She's here in Geneva, and she was in Nepal as part of the response and work that she's done there. So welcome, Victoria. I'd like to also introduce Jaime McGoldrick. Jaime is at the moment the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, but actually up until December he was the humanitarian coordinator in Nepal, and he will be talking on his experience in Nepal as in terms of leadership and managing and complex operation with a huge impact following the earthquake. And I'm delighted Jaime also happens to be today in Geneva, so he, together with Victoria and Antonio, the three of them are with me here in Geneva. And lastly, I would like to introduce Dylan Winder, who is the head of the humanitarian policy at DFID in London. Welcome, Dylan. And I know DFID has invested and done quite a lot of work on the preparedness, the importance, which we're very much looking to hearing your views as well. So a warm welcome to all four panelists. I'd like actually, Tony, to come to you with the first question. And I'd like to ask you if you can tell us 2 words, first of all, about this preparedness task team on resilience. I'm not sure many people know about it. Why is this important? And if you can tell us a little bit about also the Nepal, what are the lessons that we have got from there? So, Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. First up, I'll talk about not necessarily the team being important, but the team's support to preparedness, because preparedness is the important thing in supporting response. A bit of history. The current task team on preparedness and resilience was preceded by a sub-working group on preparedness, and it is about to move into a reference group on early warning and preparedness. I put risk on the screen because that's what we're also talking about, of course, when we look at early warning, so understanding risk. A bit of background. The important point is that early warning and preparedness and related issues remain high on the agenda of the IASC. This group is essentially based in Geneva. All the key agencies are part of it, and it is replicated in many of the regions. It has a number of lines of work. Operationally, it supports the Emergency Directors Group by producing early warning reports twice a year, with the ability to produce updates should risks change and indicators push towards a need to issue another report. You'll notice that I've got things in brackets on the screen. These are taken out of the Secretary General's report on the World Humanitarian Summit. So there is relevance of the work of this group directly to what the Secretary General is saying about the way we should be going with humanitarianism. Anticipate, do not wait. The other side of the now reference group work is related to norms and technical support. In the past, and that's got two subsets, the IASC readiness, so our ability to respond, and the ability of others to respond. As you can see, we've produced the emergency response preparedness approach. We deal with simulation methodology, and we support in making the case for preparedness. Helping others be ready, the common framework on preparedness, which as well as local actors also deals with national preparedness. And of course, we are linking the two. And you'll see that that work on helping others relates to the Secretary General's call for reinforce, do not replace local actors. And linking the two is making the work as local as possible, but having in your hip pocket the ability for the internationals to assist as well, so as international as necessary. We've heard mention of the ERP, the Emergency Response Preparedness Approach, a key product of the task team, reference group, sub-working group, the body that I've been involved with and many others on the line have been involved with. It's part of the humanitarian program cycle. It consists of a number of elements. One, understand risk, take minimum all-hazard preparedness actions, monitor risks, and if a risk is manifest, take advanced preparedness actions and contingency planning. So no need for a lot of work unless you see a risk that is manifest. Now, of course, in the Nepal situation, we've all known about the earthquake risk, and a lot of work was done related to that. I should mention that for refugee situations, UNHCR has developed a very, very similar approach. Indeed, they're completely interoperable. And for health issues, the international health regulations take over for purely health issues. I would make a few comments on Nepal, and no doubt other people will get into more detail, but I've grouped them. The basics matter. There's no silver bullet to being better prepared. You've got to invest. As a bus shelter sign in New York was saying relatively recently, related to household preparedness for disasters, winging it is not a plan. If you have not taken any preparedness action, your response is bound to be suboptimal. One caveat I would make, and the things I'm about to say, is obviously preparedness for natural disasters that are absent serious conflict are completely different from preparing for very intense conflict situations. So the Nepal earthquake is different from Syria. You cannot put a cookie cutter approach on this overall. This said, there are a number of things that are common, some of which popped out in Nepal. One, we should be smart investors. It is an investment we're making. and it should not be buried as a nice to have in what are typically ongoing underfunded projects. So we're talking about dedicated investment, and we saw some of this in Nepal. The humanitarian staging area at the airport is an example where a donor dedicated investment to a project that reaped benefits in the response. This said, we need to have a better handle on the relative potential return on investment. So we're not talking about taking money off response to invest in preparedness. We're talking about being smarter in investing what will be probably limited amounts of money in preparedness anyway, but smarter investment. But to do this, there needs to be a degree of no regrets, and we have to accept that. You might invest in something to be ready, and it might not happen, but that's the nature of the business that we're in. Related to this general financial situation, we're going to have to prioritize high-risk situations. And Nepal is a high-risk situation with earthquake, so need to invest. We need also to have greater accountability in this investment process, and the emergency response preparedness approach helps with that. We also need accountability at the global level for responding to early warning that the various groups are putting forward, in particular the IASC. This does not work unless there's professionalisation in some of the response, so more accountability there. Another big issue is we need to be coherent, and that has a number of dimensions across the responders, so national to international. We also need to be coherent against what are generally artificial phases, you know, or artificial issues: prevention, preparedness, immediate response, and recovery. We shouldn't be doing recovery or planning for recovery after everything else has happened. That has to be a parallel process. Lines of activity, we need to be prepared across various lines of response. And what I'm talking about here at the international level are obviously clusters. We can't have great preparedness in food without having good preparedness also in the other elements of a response. So balance across preparedness. And of course, preparedness across time. We're not talking about short-term engagement. Proper preparedness needs long-term engagement, particularly if we're dealing with developing the capacity of local and national actors. Last in my intervention would be familiar. And there's an adage that time in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. We saw this in Nepal, the benefit of having people that were familiar with the situation. Many of the people who deployed from the regional level were very familiar with the situation. They had been there a number of times on planning missions. But there's another side to this in that people who are not familiar, the surge needs to not push the locals aside. So we need to have people who are familiar with the situation who can come in and fit in properly. On a final note, helping people be familiar, the value of simulations is high on the agenda. And this was seen in the Nepal situation. Many people who did respond had been involved in simulations. So people had worked together, had thought through what might happen, and had worked on that a collective issue. And Panos, I think I can stop there because I'm running out of time.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. I can see lots of wisdom from the experience from many operations. I'm sure I could almost see lots of heads nodding around as you were speaking on the various elements. I want to highlight that the two protocols you refer to are at the IASC website, so colleagues can really access them and download them. We, in this webinar, we really will be talking on the practical application and how all of these were taken on board. I'm actually going to move now to Victoria. Victoria, who is working with the International Federation of Red Cross and was deployed to Nepal as part of the shelter cluster. Victoria, just from the field perspective, I really would like you to be as blunt as possible. And if you can tell us, in the Nepal context, what worked, what really tested us as a community, and what are our challenges? What is it that all of us, each colleague listening from around the world, can take from the Nepal experience in order to hopefully apply so that we are a learning community and we can do better as we go from one operation to the other. So Victoria, what are your thoughts?
Panos, thank you very much. And just a very, very quick overview. IFRC, many of you might not know, is the convener of the Shelter Cluster for Natural Disasters. I am part of the Global Surge, and I was there for the first month. And I was just very quick first slide is just to give you a quick overview of the scale of our response. Just picking out shelter means tarpaulins, tents, roofing sheets, lumber, tools, and NFIs mean kitchen sets, blankets, clothes, buckets, etc. So it was really just to give you an idea of scale of the response. So what preparedness was done before? The Nepal Shelter Cluster was first activated in 2008 in response to the Koshi floods. It's since remained active and working on preparedness and contingency planning activities and coordinating the response to small and medium-scale disasters that haven't required international assistance. But prior to the earthquake, there were approximately about 10 agencies meeting every month or two, more if needed. These meetings were often led by the government lead, DUDBC, and supported by IFRC and the Nepal Red Cross. There was an agreed contingency plan in place, which had been put in place in 2011 and worked with by OCHA, and also it had been updated in 2014. So we also did scenario planning, primarily around an earthquake in Kathmandu, and I think this was probably a lot of the scenario planning was based on an earthquake in the valley. So that obviously didn't necessarily work out well for us, given the earthquake was also in the rural areas. So that sort of caught us short. But how did preparedness work for us? I think we were able to scale up very quickly, primarily because partners and government were aware of what the cluster approach was, how it functioned, and they knew each other very well. I believe this saved a lot of time as we were able to reach out to partners far more quickly than in previous responses that didn't already have an active cluster. It also helped actually at the end of our tenure with a transition out because UN Habitat and IOM, who've taken over, were well known to the government, so there was that existing level of trust. As Tony was actually mentioning about respecting what was in place, I think another great thing that worked for us is that IFRC had a very well established and known Nepali coordinator in place. And Sanjeev has been doing this for at least the past couple of years, although this is actually one of his 3 jobs, which I'll come on to. But that did mean that his relationship was already very well established with the government, and there was a trust in place. He was absolutely crucial to our team and remained in place throughout as the government liaison and deputy coordinator. And from my perspective, you know, as a woman, he was very, very useful with government discussions. He could speak the local language, and he really, really helped navigate through the sort of the ups and downs. And for me, it would have been very difficult to come in from the outside and strike up a conversation otherwise. The contingency plan. It meant that we had an agreed understanding of what the shelter cluster scope was, the coordination arrangements, as I mentioned, scenario planning, and we also had an agreed design of an emergency shelter, including bill of quantities and approximate cost, and agreed content for response kits, and also agreed assessment questions for shelter and NFIs. So we felt like we were in a good place. I think one of the challenges around the contingency plan is that was agreed on by probably 10 agencies. We had 120 agencies coming in. So getting them to effectively adhere to what had been agreed in country was difficult. Also with internationals coming in who may not necessarily have agreed with the approach that was put in place by national colleagues. And I think that's something that the global cluster and the national clusters need to get more joined up on. Next slide. So I think, you know, it was definitely, it sounded like we were all set up and in a good position. I think there were massive things that really tested us. For starters, what we could have done better, inclusion of the private sector, even just a mapping, just really basic stuff, even just a mapping of the main producers and suppliers of our key shelter materials, including contact details of the main suppliers, and also peacetime costings. This would have had a better impact, I think, on our understanding of the market. Also discussions with the private sector about quality standards. We could have done this prior to a disaster. It's always a challenge for the shelter cluster talking about quality. We have our sort of internationally agreed standards, and very often it comes up in a discussion that national level don't meet our international requirements. And we really need to think through our flexibility and perhaps put a scale out of what's good and what really isn't good. But this meant that we could have, I think, perhaps looked to have pre-agreements with those suppliers and really engage with them from a knowledgeable way from day one. I think Jamie's office were incredibly generous with their time in getting the Chamber of Commerce together for us to have meetings. But day 4 of a rapid onset emergency is not really the time to start those conversations, and especially if you're not known to people. I think this also would have been helpful for us to support the local markets better, and also would have given us an idea of gaps. I think we talk about, and this also happened in the Philippines and happens every so often, we talk about supporting self-recovery, and yet we only have an idea of what the internationals are doing. We actually have no idea what's going on at the local level with private sector and civil society engagement. And I think it's difficult for us to expect them to fall into line with what we would like done. It perhaps should be the other way around, but I think there needs to be a much bigger level of engagement about how we operate. I think we subsequently took on a private sector coordinator whose report has just come out. So there's a link at the end of this presentation that you'll be able to have a look. It's pretty frank, and it's got some good feedback from private sector. I think there's a general sense that there's a bit of an arrogance amongst the international community that come in, and we know what's best. Cash, following on from sort of the engagement with the private sector, I guess it follows nicely. It's a major feature of this response, as you all know, and yet I think from the shelter sector perspective, we were slightly out of the conversation at the beginning. I think this is something that we continue to struggle with. Cash is very much sort of food security and livelihoods driven, but shelter really needs to up its game. We need to catch up with everyone and ensure that if the response, which is primarily shelter, which it was in Nepal, that shelter and the intricacies of it are understood by the existing cash community. I think when we're talking about unconditional or multi-purpose cash grants, we really need to analyse how best to deliver quick and useful technical products to go with the products that might be being bought. Certainly when we talk about conditional cash, it's very conditional on technical training and technical know-how, but that obviously doesn't exist when we talk about unconditional or multi-purpose cash. So that's something, again, that the cluster needs to look at, how better to engage with communications experts about how to train people on cross-bracing and all the intricacies of shelter. And again, this perhaps could be agreed in the preparedness phase, agree on the technical standards, as opposed to it took us, I think, 6 months to agree in Nepal on technical standards, because we need to get the buy-in of government and all the agencies so that there is just one message. But that could be something that should be respected, again, by all agencies involved. I think also we need to work with OCHA and other clusters a lot more about how we better track cash. And this is something that came out in the private sector report as well, a central management sort of database on cash and on how people are recording it. Certainly some of the comments in this report suggest that, most of these people in the private sector and civil society are volunteers. They don't have time to turn up to 10 cluster meetings and provide reports to 10 clusters. We need to really work much more together on that. Local level coordination is my sort of final point. This is something that really should be quite integral to the cluster system. I think financially and sort of human resource-wise, it's very difficult. It's fine having a national hub and some other hubs, but in Nepal, we needed 14 coordination teams, really. Each district had its own profile, its own local government, and its own, we have the district level can't quite remember the name, the DLSA, which Tony mentions as well in his report, which is fantastic. But we need to make sure that the international system works better within that. And we need to do much more awareness raising around training and capacity building. Certainly one of the things that's a struggle for the shelter cluster is that our national government counterpart is not necessarily the local government lead. So what can be agreed at the national level isn't necessarily bought into at the local level with government. And I think we need to work much more closely with district level coordination aspects. And also I think we need to work closely with donors to get them to support agencies that are already in place to take on that role, because I think it's a big ask for one agency to provide a coordination team times 14. It's very financially demanding. But I think also it could be flipped on its head and how we better engage with development actors. I found myself, again, through Jamie's office, sitting with the World Bank and ADB on day 3. I'm humanitarian. I don't have much of a clue how to talk to these people. I need to have a better understanding. But it was fantastic. It was the first time that it sort of felt that we were doing the right thing of bringing humanitarian in with development. But it's how to understand their processes would help us a lot, I think, and that would also help us to work more closely. So I think, just sort of finally, I think ongoing challenges, it's nothing new. It's funding, it's people. It's funding in country for preparedness. It's all well and good sort of sitting here and being self-reflective and what we could do better. But if we don't have the money and the right people in place, then this just does remain a sort of a spoken conversation or just on paper. And it's impossible to sort of advance this without dedicated resource. I think for us, certainly in the Philippines and in Nepal, I think both are consistently hit by disasters, so we know how it works. The limited, in reflection, when I talk through the big challenges, the limited gains that we had in the preparedness phase were fantastic, and I think definitely saved us probably at least a week in starting up. But I think we're entering sort of the phase of the really big private sector engagement, and we need to up our game. And urban, I really question whether we're ready for it. I think we were lucky that it wasn't a Kathmandu earthquake, because I wonder quite how we would have dealt with it. So, and there's just a link there just for the private sector coordination pilot study. It's pretty honest and it's worth a look. Thank you.
Victoria, thanks. You've given us lots of thoughts, lots of provocative thinking, but also interesting to hear from you in terms of what has worked, what tested us, the new trends, the cash, the private sector, of course, the role of the government, the local communities, and how important it is really to be ready. And if we do as much as possible in advance, and what a difference it makes in terms of the response on the ground. I'm actually going to move now to our third panelist, and I'd like to bring Jaime McGoldrick, who was the humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, and he's now in Yemen, who was in Nepal up until December. Before giving the floor to Jaime, I want to ask you all to please stay on mute. I can hear some noise on the background. Just want to make sure that all of you are on mute. And I also want to thank all of you who have sent questions, and encourage others to also send questions, which we'll be taking fairly soon. So, Jaime, you were in Nepal really when the earthquake took place. You were there when the preparedness was put in place. You went through the crisis and the initial response. Your presence there highlights the importance of leadership, what a difference it makes to have a strong leadership at the helm, to be able, at the ATT level, giving the guidance to the cluster, liaising with the government, liaising with local actors, really pulling it all together in a high-speed crisis where the preparedness can save lives, but also the timely response is vital on making it all work. So I'm delighted you just happened to be here in Geneva today to release actually the Yemen appeal for 16, and it would be good to hear from you now that we're almost 2 or 3 months after you left Nepal. What would you say has made the difference in Nepal? What was it that we got it right as humanitarian community, and what is it that, again, colleagues listening around the world should be wary to make sure that it's all in place. Victoria talked about the funding. I'm sure many of you listening in the field would like, nod your head and say, really, how can we get the funding? And we'll hear from Dylan. But money is not all. I think there's a lot more as we hear. So, Jaime, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Panos, thanks very much. And maybe just building on what Tony and Victoria have already said. I mean, the point I'd make is that, as was mentioned, Victoria, we were planning for a Kathmandu Valley earthquake and we got something else. I think that threw us off slightly. But maybe just to say that Nepal, is seen as a very highly vulnerable to a range of natural disasters, but also a very fragile political environment, post-conflict transition, constitution, with no local elections in 17 years. As a result of that, there's a very fluid national political landscape and outdated disaster management legislation. The absence of an updated disaster management legislation, you have 26 different ministries share the responsibility for that. Responsibility for the floods which happened every year was across 5 ministries. And at the same time, you have this massive, rapidly urbanizing population there. Given all the work that's gone on there, you think that Nepal should be the most prepared country in the world, given the focus of the attention over the years by the government, the national actors, the international community. But, from our side, and using the ERP was mentioned by Tony, and the support from OCHA ROAP, we reviewed the performance of our floods response in 2013 and 2014, and we had realized that the architecture had become overblown and bloated, and that lack of accountability and responsibility was there. So the year before the earthquake, we spent a year actually basically stripping down our own structures. And not a very comfortable process, but I think it gave us a good insight into where some of the gaps and some of the challenges and some of the problems lay in terms of having a better response. And I think that the reviews that have indicated that there was a key contribution made to the earthquake response because of having an effective humanitarian country team and a deployment across the districts and a better knowledge and understanding, and as was mentioned by Victoria, a comfort among those actors who understood themselves and were able to quickly get together and respond. I think many of the investments over the last years saw, I think, positive results in the earthquake response itself. The STAIT review makes the point that the core to preparedness is human resources, both to steward preparedness but also to protect investments. I think the levels of awareness have arisen in Nepal over the last few years, and as a consequence, I think necessary resourcing has been made available, although not enough. But this is a challenge. The report also indicates that the 100 recommendations, and over which there are 3/4 of them are for the Resident Coordinator's Office and the Humanitarian Country Team. The Resident Coordinator's Office in Nepal is quite well capacitated, but I don't think that's necessarily common across other country teams. So I would say that while it's a recommendation, other countries would struggle to bring that up to speed. At the time of the disaster, the earthquakes that affected Nepal, we were 4 years into which we thought was a 20-year preparedness, resilience, building of work plan. 20-year work plans, as you know, are not comfortable for either national governments or for the international community or the development systems, and especially not the humanitarian world. The economic case for preparedness and disaster risk reduction is well established, yet there's a massive reluctance to accept the implications that development practice must change and development programs must be more risk-informed. Humanitarians cannot work on a 20-year timeline, and responsibility must be assumed by the core development business of any country. In Nepal, we sought to try and marry the humanitarian actors with the development institutions with mixed results. And as we said with Victoria there, that the humanitarians were meeting very early on with the recovery and reconstruction actors. Over a series of reviews, including the 2013 Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium review, noted that the collective efforts at awareness raising of the seismic threat were certainly resulted in an increased awareness on the part of the national government and among the national organisations, internationals. And budgets for resilience and preparedness had increased somewhat, but I don't think enough. But I think the government and the donors and agencies were challenged to making the necessary jump from individual projects that they had to a long-term, sustained, coherent preparedness approach, and that's something we struggled with. A key area of preparedness was that we had 800 community disaster risk management programs throughout Nepal since 2011. That raised awareness and stimulated communities and households in preparedness and increased, I think, resilience. However, I think reviews have shown that the focus was in the Kathmandu Valley, where the communities were sensitive to the seismic risks and the threats. But and they also understood the communication. They had go bags. They were equipped with tools for search and rescue. But it didn't go in the districts where the actual earthquakes took place this time. The cluster system in Nepal had been nationalised in 2013, and the construction of a national disaster response framework was there, and you had the ministries and the roles and responsibilities. You know, successes of that would be that on the clusters during the earthquake, they activated in 5 hours. For example, the Minister of Health was up and running on day one. And unfortunately, the same level of familiarity was not seen systematically at district level. And I think, as I mentioned before, there's been local elections for 17 years, so there was an absence of governance at that level. And we've now put an annual planning process at district level, and hopefully that will help. But however, how do you get preparedness to be institutionalized at the local level if it's not part of an overarching development mainstream approach? The preposition in Nepal, in the Kathmandu Valley and some of the affected districts, I think was good, was important, and it was affected, and the after action review concluded that the stocks made a significant impact in saving lives. However, some of the stocks available are not utilised by the communities or local authorities, and some of the stocks were actually out of date, and some were not even meeting the right standards. I think so. The point is that at very local level, the challenges and the cost of maintaining preparedness is something that we have to factor in. The establishment of the humanitarian staging, as mentioned by Tony, prior to the international airport, the only international airport with the only runway it can hold large planes. And the weeks before the earthquake was universally praised by all reviews. This was a result, although it was fortuitous, it was a result of many years of advocacy and lobbying. And with other wins described here, sustainability will be the key issue. Similarly, while all the reviews recommend we increase stocks at both central and local level, the burden of making the value for money case remains, and I don't know whether donors will front up for this one. And it was also mentioned by Tony the emergency preparedness process. Nepal was one of the 2 countries in Asia piloting it, and we focused on the flood response, but I think it provided a focus for the international community, and I think it allowed us to agree on the level of data required, mostly available and analysed in advance, necessary, I think, to trigger and design our initial response, and agree on the initial sectoral areas that would be the priorities, and ensure that the protection agenda was very centralised, and lay much of the groundwork to ensure that the first SITREPs went out within 36 hours of the earthquake, and the flash appeal went out within 4 days. And I think that was because of the preparedness on data collection and understanding the communities we're working in. The State Review has noticed that the beneficial effect of the ERP mechanism upon the Nepal readiness, and praised the light approach while questioning the extent to which it involved all agencies and all relevant NGOs. This is perhaps a point for other countries to consider. How do we get the right balance of not being over-engineered, but being effective and being light and being inclusive of all the right actors? The regular regional office for Asia Pacific for OCHA and the resident coordinator's office in the flagship too, I think in terms of involvement in military trainings and simulations were helpful, I think, in providing some insight to both planning and response. Despite the fact that there was not an earthquake that we were planning for, I think the joint preparedness, the annual simulation exercises of the DOD and the World Food Programmes, the regional logistics assessments of 2012, I think all provided assumptions to support the initial design of the 2015 response. So I think those investments paid off. And despite OCHA's withdrawal from Nepal in 2013, and the fact that for several years preceding they've been downsizing, the regional office in Bangkok and the resident coordinator's office consciously worked to sustain the relationships through the regional office's ongoing contribution to preparedness activities. In fact, a team from OCHA Rope has spent a week in Nepal in March supporting the flood preparedness, and I think this was instrumental in supporting the RC and the humanitarian country team in the first week, because it was the same people who came back to do the flash appeal and do the whole support to the resident coordinator's office. So from our side, it was an extraordinarily good investment, and we were very fortunate to have those people. The value of the pre-existing humanitarian country team and the mechanism incorporating donors. We had donors in the HCT Plus and INGO representatives in the response, including the key national NGOs. I think rapidly create a consultation process and decision-making in response. And a key part of this was a pre-established and strong supportive relationship with the humanitarian donors our small donor group, the usual suspects who support humanitarian work, the DFIDs, the ECHOs, and the USAIDs. We had those in on a daily basis, and we met prior to each HCT to try and triangulate the contextual and humanitarian information to prioritise and deconflict those challenges. I think this was praised by the STAIT team, and I think this speaks to the value of adding donors on the ground and their intention to remove barriers and to coordinate among themselves so that they can prioritise these daily meetings in the days following the earthquakes. That was an essential steer for us to get the right direction, get the right buy-in, and to keep people disciplined in the humanitarian country team at a time when things were very fraught and very unstable. Most people wanted to rush off. And then in that regard, we were able to push the humanitarian coordination mechanisms in the cluster system up to the affected districts away from the capital, which I think was an important step forward. I'll just say that the ERP mechanism to consolidate preparedness training will continue inside Nepal, and it's very, very important that we do that. And just to mention two other things before I close. One of it is what Victoria mentioned, the whole idea of having contracts with the private sector. We had water tankering companies established in advance of the earthquake, and that ensured rapid response in some areas. But I think we have to do more of that. We could have done more to reach out to the private sector and offer experience and advice over time if the agencies, the international communities, had been prepared to act collectively with one voice instead of acting opportunistically with a view to building relations for the future. As a sector, the private sector, we should stop seeing them as a resourcing opportunity, but instead as a delivery partner and a potential change agent. And maximising this resource for the benefit of people in crisis will require, I think, more and better coherence from us as a sector, as well as devoted human resources to that end. And just to say the last thing on the cash, also we have to do more on cash. We did 10% of our response on cash, and we have to work close with the private sector, the banking, the telephone companies to make sure that works better. And in the next few months, hopefully we'll see developments of that improvement in terms of preparation and preparedness for the future. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jaime. I can actually see several of the points that also Victoria referred to, the cash, the private sector, and so on. But also thanks for going through your reflections. Jaime, as you were speaking, I got a provocative question that one of the listeners sent right away. And since it's 45 minutes past the hour, I'm going to take this question before we go to London to hear also from Dylan. Jaime, one of the callers, one of the colleagues was listening and saying, it's all good what you're saying. In reality, in our HCT, it's very difficult to prioritize preparedness and invest in preparedness where the response itself is underfunded. So how do we juggle this giving priority to preparedness where we can barely meet the life-saving minimum standard assistance and the funding is less than half of what we have asked? So how do we juggle? I'm sure I don't know what was your experience in Nepal, but I mean, we can talk about, of course, the principle and the importance, and we all agree about it, but bottom line, in reality, in today's very difficult context, how do we prioritize preparedness versus actual response on the day-to-day needs of life-saving assistance to people? Jaime, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Panos. Okay. Thanks, Panos. My suggestion would be that the humanitarian country team would sit down and look at a previous response activity that's undertaken, be it a flood or a landslide or something that's affected that country, strip it down in terms of what worked and why it worked and what didn't work, and then put together a more optimal, critical view of the response. And then I think in that exercise, bring the donors in to see what they've invested in, see what the impact of those investments in terms of response were, and then see how you could actually address those response impacts with a different way of working in advance of that. And the preparedness activities, I think you would see that there would be a more optimal use of the funds, a more optimal response to whether it be a flood or a landslide. That's what we did. And we then we put the clusters into tiers. And we had a first-tier cluster and a second-tier cluster, so we actually streamlined the response and streamlined the request for funds. And that way donors see you prioritising, which is something they're very keen on, and that way we were able to get support for preparedness activities. I think the ERP process is a very important thing for country teams to take on board and use that as your guidance in this regard. To you.
Thanks, Jaime. That's very useful. We heard Jaime talking really about taking the ERP process, looking at what's first tier, second tier, a very difficult exercise to actually do and agree, but how vital it is when indeed the resources cannot cover it all. And talking of resources, and not just resources, I'd really like to bring on this conversation Dylan. Dylan is joining us. Dylan Winder is the head of the Humanitarian Policy and Partnership. He's joining this conversation from London. He's working with DFID. So Dylan, I'd like to ask you, I know that DFID, you did some work on providing an evidence base for preparedness, research and working with the World Food Programme and UNICEF, where you looked at the return on investment approach, which is really quite interesting when one makes the business case for preparedness. So I'd like to ask you, on this work that you've done, what really made a difference? Are we convinced enough as a community for preparedness? Are other donors like-minded like DFID in terms of really understanding the value of it and investing on preparedness? Would be very interesting to hear your perspective, Dylan. Over to you. Dylan, we cannot hear you. Please make sure you unmute yourself. Okay, while we're sorting out the sound problem with Dylan, I would like actually to go to Tony. And Tony, there's a caller who sent us a question saying, there are the IASC guidelines on the ERP that looks more on preparedness rather than the humanitarian response, the DRR. Victoria made reference to the need to work more with local capacity. Actually, Jaime made the same point as well. So the question is, how can the ERP link between the ISDR, which to anticipating the capacity building, how can the clusters build agreements in order to ensure better preparedness? And this question comes from a colleague who sent it from the World Vision. Tony, over to you.
Thanks, Panos. This is a question that is at the crux of much of what has been in the Secretary General's report about how we better link up preparedness and development. Oh, sorry, humanitarian action and development action. One of the things you should be aware of is that you and ISDR have a whole process of words into action. And part of that is guidance on how to do preparedness for response. It's something we're very interested in the IASC task team and in the reference group, and it's work we're going to bring forward. So we're going to be linking up this ERP approach to what the ISDR is doing with its partners, and pretty much they're the same partners. So that's work that is ongoing. It's actually quite critical to linking preparedness by us and national actors. And indeed, it's a fantastic question because it's at the crux of where we're moving forward. So we're not taking different approaches at the international level than what national actors would be taking. So short answer, we're working with ISDR, UN ISDR, on their efforts to implement their approach to preparedness. If I may, there are other quick questions that I can answer. The ERP guidance, yes, it does replace guidelines 2007. Yes, it was put out in beta. It is being tested for 2 years, not one, 2016, 2017, as is the whole of the humanitarian program cycle. So those questions, including the one I answered before, are directly related. We're going to be taking work to better link what the international preparedness system does to national actors, to DRR action through this 2-year, and we'll be amending the ERP as we go and taking that at the end of the 2 years. All this said, the ERP is pretty fundamental. No risk, take some minimum preparedness actions, and when you see something on the horizon or you know a particular risk, earthquake Kathmandu or earthquake Nepal we know about the risk, take some advanced actions. We can do that now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. A loud and clear, I would say, message with the advanced actions. I understand that the technical problem with London has been sorted out. So, Dylan, good to have you online. We just wanted to hear from you. I'm not sure if you heard my question a minute ago.
I heard the question. That's
great. So, welcome, Dylan. You have the floor.
Great, thanks. And I'm sorry about our DFID security systems, which make this sort of thing quite difficult. Anyway, it's great to be here. I wanted to say, first of all, that a lot of the points that Jamie, Tony, and Victoria made really resonate with us. I mean, we think preparedness is really important more globally. It saves lives, saves money, and does protect development investment. And it's a key part of our new ODA strategy. And those of you who listen to our Secretary of State will notice that she mentions preparedness quite often as well. So we've got the senior political buy-in, and a lot of that was developed through providing the kind of evidence that I know you want me to talk about. I think also for us, preparedness needs to be part of a package. It needs to be part of something where we're looking at anticipation, risk assessment, building resilience. We've done that across all of our country programs in our development sector. So it really is emphasizing this point about the need to link development with humanitarian. And I think that the World Humanitarian Summit offers a really fantastic opportunity to do that. And I think, you know, that even the Nepal exercise, we learned a lot from that. And, you know, urban, private sector cash, these things are really going to be critical. And we don't yet know how, particularly on the urban side, we're going to be able to do this at some of the preparedness work more effectively. On Nepal, we did invest substantially up front. I think we had £20 million grants. Jamie probably knows it more than I do, but certainly we worked with UNDP, but also within the UK government, we did our own contingency planning exercises. We also did that with our local office in Kathmandu. So these kind of things I think you'll see much more commonly now across DFID. I think the big challenge for us actually is something that probably we're not going to get into much detail here, but is the kind of conflict piece. So how do we build preparedness and resilience for conflicts, which of course for us is about 70% of our humanitarian spend. So let me come back to your quick question. So who needs convincing? I think, as you say, it's probably everybody that needs convincing. I think some donors are further than others. I think national governments need to be more convincing. To be honest, when we talk to our senior management here, the thing that really got them was the economic impact of not doing preparedness. So if we can link preparedness programming with the damages both on life but also on economics, I think we'll be in a better place. So we believe that preparedness does need to be more tested. On the WUF UNICEF Programme, which has now expanded, again, that was a £38 million global programme. And we wanted within that to really provide more robust evidence on the returns for investment and to try and quantify the effectiveness of being well prepared. We evaluated all the preparedness activities in the programme, so training, capacity building, stockpiling, infrastructure investments, to see whether they really did save money. And I think also we wanted to develop some kind of value for money metrics and modelling. So we did include quite a robust modelling element to that work. Great,
thanks, Dylan. It's very interesting to see actually this return to investment work that you've done. Would you elaborate a little bit further? Does it really save money? I guess the key question is, does it save lives, more importantly?
So yeah, the evidence we collected from the programme did show that preparedness saves time and money. And of course, the time bit is about lives. So we assessed 49 investments in 3 countries. And those range from, as I said, the training, capacity building, partnership, stockpiling, infrastructure pieces. And we wanted to, without wanting to lose the audience with too many statistics, the results showed that being well prepared had an average of saving around 210% across all the investments. So that's really a return of, for every dollar in preparedness, we saved about $2.10, and that's a really important figure, and we have used that a lot in terms of our advocacy work internally within DFID. But this isn't only good for us as a donor, but also the whole system, and more importantly, those receiving assistance. That the savings that we feel can be reinvested in other emergency programs that are life-saving or last longer, and also support recovery efforts. These estimates are conservative, actually, because we're not basically trying to understand the full economic benefits from responding early are quite challenging, so we haven't included that. But we do think that these returns are conservative. And I do want to emphasise that as a donor, we're much more interested in what the funding generates in terms of the timeliness of responses, i.e. the kind of results, the impact. So the research did uncover an average of about a week that could be saved in terms of response time through the same investments. And we also wanted the time estimates because by having faster and better equipped response, we believe that we can save more lives. And this was certainly the case in Chad's cholera response at the beginning of last year. So in terms of kind of visualizing the investments, and again, without wanting to lose any, you'll see the results plotting the time and the cost savings for all 49 investments. This is on the next slide, sorry. And the reason I wanted to show this is because it illustrates very clearly that in some cases, we paid more to be faster. So if you look at all the points below on the kind of y-axis, that sets that out. And if I could leave you with one thought to take away from these results, it would be that they also demonstrate how codependent the investments are. So, for example, stockpiles rely on trained staff and partnerships to deliver their full benefit. We need a systematic approach, not a siloed one. And we've actually got another program that's a different program to the UN one with NGOs. It's a £40 million program where we're combining the sort of training of local capacity, specific skills building, policy enabling environment, and also a £10 million private sector innovation window to look at how can we really work more with the private sector to bring new technology, new thoughts to this arena.
Thanks, Dylan. Actually, we're getting questions back to you as you speak, so I'll come back to you in a minute. I'd like actually to come to Victoria now. Victoria, I have 3 different questions from listeners, from our colleagues, who are really asking about the role of the local actors, the local communities in terms of preparedness. Were local communities in Nepal prepared, given the repetition, the frequency of the disasters that have taken place, how prone the country is, and there's a number of other countries in the world who are prone to this. So the preparedness of local communities, and also there's a question about the involvement of the national NGOs in the clusters, because all of you actually spoke about the importance of this relation of dignity, of respect, of ownership, because bottom line, these are the people who know best and who are there to help their own communities. So if you could give us your reflection and answer to these 2 questions about local communities and local NGOs and the response.
Okay, Panos. I think I can talk about effectively the Nepal Red Cross, perhaps with a bit more confidence at the local level. I know obviously that they respond on a monthly basis, I think, to small disasters. They're present in every district. They have branches, they have chapters. They're really involved at the local community level. And I know that from the Red Cross point of view, we and many countries with their national societies have invested in the Nepal Red Cross around preparedness. They run trainings at the community level, and I know that, for instance, the British Red Cross did a big program on earthquake preparedness, and they've just released an after-action review to see how that really how that really came about. So trying to look outside the Kathmandu Valley. Obviously, they're spread widely. They need it's often just one or two people that are available in the local chapters, but they are part of the community. These people are volunteers from the community themselves. So really that's a good vehicle for us to get engaged in community awareness. Around the ownership side of things from national NGOs, I mean, I think it probably comes back to what the cluster is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the cluster system was really set up to coordinate the internationals coming in. And we talk a lot about capacity building and involving the national NGOs and the local NGOs, but I think one thing that's so obvious to me is, as I can only speak English, I can certainly not speak Nepali. And so when you've got 250, 300 people turning up to a cluster meeting and you're speaking in English, you're automatically sort of discounting many, many people there. And I think, the international circus arrives in town, and we do, by our systems, we push people out, and certainly trying to explain to a room full of national and local NGOs what a flash appeal is quite technical. And I do think we speak our own language, and we really need to consider how to continue to engage those local and national NGOs, and also just the time that is required for them to attend the cluster coordination meetings, to be part of that process. It's a big demand that we're asking of them, and a lot of them, as I said, are volunteers, and trying to get to grips with this system that suddenly takes over is difficult. I mean, certainly we had three good national NGOs that were very engaged in the preparedness phase, and they were actually part of our strategic advisory group. And NSET was one of them. They're one of the main players, I'd say, in Nepal around building and shelter response. So that very much helped us, but it's difficult to reach out to national NGOs when you don't speak the language.
So that's an important element, really, with the language and the ability to connect, involve them, engage them on the ground. Jaime, I have a question for you, which we got, which is really, the question is about the actual practical experience of the HCT, the Humanitarian Country Team in Nepal. And I think you made some reference on it in your presentation. So the question is, the HCT, did you take time to look at the ERP, the emergency response, the approach to the earthquake? How much did you prepare in Nepal in advance, and how helpful was it once the crisis hit, once the earthquake took place?
Okay, Panos, yeah, thanks very much. To me, the HCT was the vehicle whereby we were going to respond to this crisis. It was the place where we all got on the same page. It was the place where we had a broad base of NGOs, UN agencies, and clusters as well, but also I think we had national, local NGOs involved too. We didn't have the government in the HCT, which is maybe a question you'd have to ask, what would you do in that regard? So I think it was, for us, it was a vehicle by also having a plus system, having the donors inside there as well. It kept us very disciplined and very focused. I'm a great believer in results orientated, so the way we ran the HCTs was that there was only the discussion of the points we needed to discuss, and we didn't get away to having these long meetings. It was very sharp meetings. The ERP process was something that we had initiated in advance, the November before the earthquake, to deal with the floods and to resharpen our approach and response to floods and landslides, which are annual occurrences there. So I think, as we've all mentioned, that the familiarity and the connectivity and the networks that were created around the ERP through the HCT, I think put us in a very good position when the earthquake struck, because when those people came in the room, there was a familiarity, there's an understanding. And we've used the ERP to gather data on disaggregated data in terms of vulnerabilities and community profiles, and at the same time a better understanding of our own ability and the agencies we work for ability to respond to crises such as floods, but in this case for the earthquake. So having an ERP which was a live exercise, having the OCHA people from ROAP and others supporting us who then came in to do the response with us, and having an HCT which was in tune with what the capacities, resources and response requirements were, I think was very favourable, and it's a model I would use if I had to do it again the exact same way. I wouldn't change anything.
Great. Jamie, what I heard you talking about is really not about the meetings, but is about the efficiency of putting together. I heard about this discipline, this focus on picking up the issues that needed to be discussed, making sure it's not a meeting that goes on for hours, but it's focused and it's results-oriented. So there is a value, and this is often, I have to say, an issue we hear in many of these missions we do around the world. It's not just for meeting, but really the discipline, the focus, and the results to get out of it and to be able to put the issues that are at the heart of the matter on the table as we go. Tony, I'd like to come back to you with a question. We have a caller who is asking the ERP guidelines. Is it for the IASC? How does it align with local government preparedness? How do we ensure that what we do as NGOs or UN really line up, bottom line, everything we do is to support the government. So how do we bring it together in a way that is, of course, helpful to the government, and we bring our best expertise and capacity on the ground? Tony.
Thanks, Panos. It was part of the question posed before as well, linking how we do preparedness to how national actors do preparedness. The most effective way is linking directly to what they're doing. This would have to change from country to country because, as I mentioned, what the humanitarian community does in preparing for conflict, it might be totally different from what it does in preparing for natural disaster. But let's just take the natural disaster thing before. And as I made the point somewhere else, not all governments use, for instance, the cluster approach. Some do. The Nepalese government actually uses the cluster approach. They have clusters that are linked to the international cluster. So there's a natural linkage there. But say they don't do that in another country where that doesn't happen, I think the internationals have to be far more proactive in setting up their structures to link to how national actors respond. And the ERP needs to take that into account. It does nominally at the moment, but I think in its revision we have to include that as an issue. Seeing you've given me slightly the floor, Dylan mentioned that the comment on preparedness for conflict. This is where there is, in part of the Secretary General's report, maintain an emergency capacity. So in all this developed national capacity, all of that, that's a very strong focus at the moment, national and local capacity. There are situations where you still will require the international capacity to respond. I would say that that needs a system look. So it's not just at the country level, because international actors don't respond just with what's at the country level. And in big emergencies, regional and global systems have to kick in to respond. So that's where I think we need probably some focus to continue at the international level. I have some other issues on some other things that I mentioned, but I'll come back to that later.
Thanks, Tony. A very, very important aspect, bringing the government, everybody together in this response. I'd like us to take us back to London, back to Dylan. And Dylan, we have got some callers sending questions talking about what I would describe 4 circles on this equation of preparedness. You have, of course, the humanitarian actors on the ground. There's also the development actors. You know, this is not just about humanitarian actors' preparedness. Of course, the government, the role of the government, Tony was just talking about this, but also the role of the donors. Clearly, from what you say, the question I have, DFID sounds convinced about the importance and putting resources on preparedness. How about other donors, and how to bring all these 4 circles together to move forward to ensure that the resources, the political will, the development, the humanitarian, and everybody moves forward on investing, on preparing, on training, on doing all the right things to ensure we're ready?
I think it is a challenge. I mean, I think we're some of the way there with the evidence that we've got. So I think, you know, the reports that we produce through the Preparedness Programme, the stuff that you've been doing in Nepal is really critical. What we need to do is to really share that much more broadly and at a much more senior level. And I think we do need to really make this economic case about protecting development investment, which will then encourage the development side of the house to much more focus on these sorts of issues. And I think what we need is we need the IFIs to have a standard, a more risk-based approach to how they do national planning. We need to make sure that governments have a much better sense of what those types of risks are in advance, and therefore we can prepare much better and focus resources against those particular types of risks. And I think, as Tony just mentioned, I think we do need to see more bespoke responses as well to different types of crises. So if we are internationally surging, let's surge into the government systems rather than just, in a way, use a kind of cookie-cutter approach. In terms of the sort of next steps for us, I think really the World Humanitarian Summit offers a kind of key moment to really look at what preparedness can actually do, both in terms of saving lives, but also in terms of addressing some of the really critical issues around the massive resource gap that we see at the moment between the sort of global appeals and the amount of money that annually goes against them. And I think also it can help by bringing in new different types of financing. So, for example, we're doing quite a lot of work with the insurance industry to look at how can we do better in those places where we know the risks are a bit more predictable, so we can set up insurance mechanisms that will respond to those risks, and thereby taking that funding out of the sort of very valuable humanitarian flexible funding more globally. And I think this humanitarian development issue, I mean, it's really interesting what Victoria said about, I was a humanitarian and I didn't really know how to talk to the development agencies. Well, we need to break down those barriers, and we need to make sure that humanitarians are tooled up so that they're not worried about talking to development actors. They do understand what the kind of instruments are that the development sector uses. And I think there are really good examples as well. So if you look at Lebanon and the sort of Lebanese crisis response plan, which was Moumtzis pulled together, that does very much link humanitarian development planning, assessment. It has a kind of political piece, but it also then will help to prepare for future issues and be multi-year. And I think that's the other important thing that we need to do in preparedness. We can't just work on annual humanitarian budgets. We must move more towards a sort of development longer-term approach.
Thanks, Bill. And I think DFID, indeed, you are in under the same roof. You have the development, the humanitarian. I'd like to come back to the question that was asked about how about other donors within the Good Humanitarian Donorship platform. How do we make sure that other donors also approach the same approach as you have taken, given the importance on preparedness and making sure that it's a broader approach? Can you share a little bit? And I know some other donors are doing it, but not all. Obviously.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are two levels here. I think, as Jamie mentioned, that it's really important to have donors as part of the HCT and to make sure that those donors are connecting into the development bit. So certainly planning on the ground, most donor agencies will be involved in some kind of donor coordination mechanism that probably runs in parallel to the HCT. So we really need to get the join up there at a country level. Internationally, I think there are, as you say, a few donors who are very interested. I mean, the Germans are really interested in preparedness. There are other examples as well. So I think we need a fora really where we as donors can talk more about some of the benefits of these. And I know that the IASC task force has reached out to a number of donors. Maybe we could do better at kind of bringing donors into these kind of discussions. But again, I think that the key moments this year where we really need to have this discussion, the spring meetings at the World Bank, we need this discussion there collectively with donor colleagues. We need to have this discussion at the summit, the World Humanitarian Summit. We've then got UNGA and the two other protracted crisis events. So we need to make the most of these kind of events. We need better forums where a global level donors can come together to talk about some of these issues. And I think it's really critical that at country level, the HCTs aren't separate completely from the donors. And I think if we can make all these linkages, and we can work much more collectively together.
Thanks, Bill. I know it's important that we're all of the same mindset and we all have at least a clear vision and direction in terms of where we're going, because all of us, each of us, bring a different weight to this equation. I'd like to highlight to everybody who's listening, and I'm glad to see we still have over 100 participants, including on YouTube, listening to this conversation, that as we're going to the final 10 minutes of this webinar, there is a poll that has opened. Please take a minute as you're listening to give us your feedback. This is very useful, in particular since we're repeating the same webinar at 5 p.m. Geneva time, and we're always trying to see how to better improve. So please take a minute to answer to the poll. In the meantime, I'm going to take us back to Tony, who has highlighted he also wants to add some points further to Dylan. And I want to ask all speakers as we go through the final few minutes to please be as brief as possible, because I still have quite a few questions to go through. Tony.
Just a quick one, Panos, and following on from what Dylan is saying, indeed, I've kind of got a question for Dylan, because some of the background of the questions about, hey, we want to do preparedness, but we need resources. Well, vision without resources is hallucination. One thing on the IASC grouping, we will be trying to take forward this return on investment study. It covered 3 countries, and we're looking at seeing how applicable it is elsewhere and to widen the base. But I guess the question for Dylan is related to this partnership that we've developed with DFID. I know it's quite strong on the ground in Nepal. It has been in the multi-agency project that you've got. It did come with a cost, and the cost is, you know, contact, justifying, having short notice information requirements from DFID. For instance, you know, we invested there, we notice you're now responding, give us some evidence that it really was worthwhile. Does that really resonate with your minister and with other leadership in your country, Dylan, when we do provide that effort? Because it is an extra bonus, extra burden in the minds of some people. So it really does it hit the buttons.
Shall I just respond very quick? Yes, absolutely. It's critical. I mean, these are the live moments. These are the moments where we get to, in a way, as donors, tell the world what we're doing, and particularly tell our taxpayers what we're doing. So it's really critical that during these events we are able to explain what we're doing. We are able to show that we've really thought about things, that we are providing value for money, you know, we are providing efficiency, but also that our investments have helped save lives. I mean, that's absolutely where we want to be. And I think, you know, part of the upfront investment, particularly within the program that you're talking about, has been the fantastic collaboration between the UN agencies. And I think that's a key thing that happened in advance that has made this whole program work. You know, without that collaboration, without thinking through collectively in advance, I don't think we would be in the position we are now, with the Secretary of State and senior ministers buying into this approach.
Okay, I'm going actually to get to my question. I understand I was on mute, so I'll repeat it. Victoria, the question is about the role of the local communities. How do we go about it? How do we ensure that this relation of dignity is there? And also, if you can say a few words about the women and girls' need in particular, that we didn't talk about it in a natural disaster. So if you could please give us your, I would say, highlight of reflection, because this topic alone can be a separate webinar altogether.
Okay, well, I think perhaps one thing that we need to remember with the local level is, from our perspective, is we're there to provide, to support the most vulnerable. And I think one of our key roles around coordination is to really see where the gaps are and where perhaps the overlaps are, and the right people are getting the right stuff. And I think perhaps what we need to do more is work with the government about, it's just sort of perhaps even just databases, data management, how to track who gets what where. It's not something that we can come in and set up without districts, without communities being aware of the need to have a reporting mechanism. Okay, it might not need to be a sort of information management platform, but there needs to be a means of us collating and being aware or having areas highlighted to us that need more assistance. I think perhaps when you talk about dignity and local resources, I see there's a question around that, perhaps using cash more. Again, it's more kind of discussion with the private sector, understanding the local markets and really being able to support the local markets if the quality is there. I think when Dylan talks about value for money, us spending money on shelter goods that are only going to disintegrate within 2 weeks is not really providing the response we should be doing. So that needs to have a better discussion with, as I said, the suppliers and the producers to make sure that the quality is there and that we can trust the local market and that it's feasible to use it. I think that would really help with giving everyone that right to dignity, and I think we all agree that that's one of the bonuses of cash. Gender, I think, again, you could relate this to cash as well. I think one thing that we found was a lot of men were overseas, working in the Middle East. How to support women and girls on rebuilding their houses when they don't have that facility. One thing that we've really pushed is training masons, training sort of semi-skilled labour. And again, cash can be used to use those skilled personnel to help women rebuild houses if they need it. Also making sure that training is available to all. I think shelter is very much seen as a sort of a man's world. And women generally do quite a lot of the work themselves, but really look at training them as to understanding the safety. And also children as well are great advocates. If they understand, they can easily suggest to mum and dad that they might be wanting to do something differently. But for the cluster, I think it's prioritisation really. We talk about supporting the most vulnerable. It's really working out who those vulnerable people are. When we even just sort of mentioning the fact that men are abroad, remittances, just because you've got a single female-headed household doesn't necessarily mean that she has not got the financial support. It might be coming in from abroad. We need to understand that context more so that we don't just say we need to support all female-headed households because they might not necessarily need the support where others might. Hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks a lot. That's very helpful. I want to remind everybody again, there is an opening poll that is open. We would like to hear your views and on this webinar and what you found useful. Jamie, I'm going actually to come with you with a very brief question, which is about the engagement with local governments on the spot. And in some places, of course, we face challenges while we try to respond to an emergency, either because of the government's role imposing taxes or difficulties on bureaucratic impediments or on permits to import the necessary materials. What's your experience with that? Which is really, I mean, we know with the government, they definitely want us to help their people, but at the same time, there is a system, a bureaucracy, or a politics sometimes that makes our work very difficult.
Yeah, thanks, Panos. I think one of the things we faced there in terms of the humanitarian response was, I think, that the government's understanding of they had to be on a war footing and respond accordingly. But unfortunately, in Nepal, it's quite a bureaucratic situation, and the government is quite heavy civil service. The lack of local governance structures, lack of elections for 17 years, I think there was maybe more understanding, more work needs to be done. I would have suggested that what I should have done as humanitarian coordinator is to go to the head of the civil service very early on in the response and talk to him about what needed to be done. I was speaking to line ministries and the parts of the government which were responding rather than the central bureaucracy, because what had happened was that when agencies and organisations started to import material, after 30 days the government wanted to declare the emergency over, and they then wanted to get back to business as usual, which was importing any goods coming in, shelter material, non-food relief items, etc., were being taxed at the border, VAT and others, and added some 30% tax money to people bringing these in. We should have done more on that, and I think it was something that it's a lesson that I've learned that I'd have done it differently by going centrally and getting a more permissive approach from the civil service than we actually had. I think the local level, we had very good relations in the districts which were affected. I think we set up the connection, the support to those district relief committees worked very, very well. I think sometimes there was a disconnect between the district level and central level. I think it wasn't helped by the fact that the district leaders or the chief district officers were changed. 7 of them out of the 14 districts were changed in week 1, and I think that caused a little bit of confusion. But other than that, I think that we could learn a lesson by being much more engaged with central bureaucracy to get them to understand to be more, reduce their impediments and more permissive. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I have another question for you, again, very briefly, because we're running out of time, which is about the importance of taking into account the voice, the needs of the people we're trying to help. How did you make sure in Nepal that what you were doing really responded to the people's needs, and it wasn't us Westerners kind of knowing better what the people need and going ahead on our own?
Well, I think a number of things. I think we had a good profile of some of the districts we worked in, the disaggregated data. It was mentioned, Victoria, some of the dignity and the vulnerabilities that were there. I think what we also did, we created this, which was called Communication for Communities. And it was a way whereby we used local actors, we used local organizations such as Boy Scouts. We used the mobile phone system, and we allowed people to be part of a loop. And what we did was that was headed, or it was hosted through the resident coordinator's office. And it was a way of monitoring the rumour and the speculation at local level. And at the same time, collecting regular data, also longitudinal data on the needs of the communities. And I think at the same time to try and push back on the misperceptions. There was a lot of media attention about people receiving and not receiving, the politicalisation of aid, the diversion of aid. And I think having that local information let us understand the quality assurances we needed, but at the same time to push back on some of these political rumours that have been established. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Really the vital importance of listening to the people we're trying to help, taking into account their point of view, having a two-way communication back and forth, and ensuring this relation of dignity and respect. Bottom line is our accountability towards the people we're trying to help. I have a last question which I'm going to take to Dylan, and it's a spicy question. Dylan, I have to warn you. The question is about the funding of DFID and funding for preparedness. So the caller sends a message saying it's great, of course it's highly valued, fantastic to have a donor, but how do you make sure that when funding is very narrowly earmarked to a project with very specific outcomes, that this is aligned actually with the government priorities, and if anything, it really builds upon strength the government's priorities in terms of preparedness and the response that needs to take place. So Dylan, if you can share your thinking on that.
Great, thanks, Panos. And I mean, I think that's absolutely critical. It's a really important point. Certainly, at a country level, we should be doing that. I think working with development, the development side of our house, well, we don't have a, as you know, we're joined up at country level, is really critical to make those links with the governments. And I think what we can do at the global level, and the programs I was talking about are global, is make sure again that they are lining up with governments. But also there are the global structures, so the strategic response plans, the sort of way in which we do business also reflects that in countries where we can work with governments, which is most countries, I would say. And I also think that you know, we need to really improve the kind of partnerships we have with governments, and again learn from, you know, what are the good experiences of learning with government. I led our response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and there we worked quite closely with the Social Welfare Ministry. Philippines government, as I think someone said, was set up around the cluster system. I'm not sure whether that's the right or the wrong approach, but we should be going, you know, with very much with how government works. And I think Jamie made some good points about the sort of the bureaucracy, the links with local government. Are there things that we can get the development side of the house to do to reduce some of those blockages in terms of how we do civil service reform in countries, for example, through the development side? So I think there's lots of opportunities to do that. We're not as good as we should be, but we can be better. And one point I didn't make, which I should make, is there's a lot of opportunity in terms of investment around climate finance. And I think increasingly with the sort of COP commitments, we should make sure that preparedness features as part of that sort of whole climate funding element.
Thanks, thanks, Dylan. Tony, you have the final word in 30 seconds or less.
just a slight follow-on from that, that humanitarian staging area has been developed for the government in the longer term as well. So this is an example of an investment that is handed over to the government, indeed used with the government as well now.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. This brings us to the end of this webinar. I hope you've all taken a minute to respond to the polling. More importantly, I hope you found this practical field guidelines and best experiences from the Nepal earthquake response helpful for your own operation. I'd like to thank our speakers. I want to thank Tony Craig, who is the co-chair of the IASC Task Team on Preparedness and Resilience. I'd like to thank Victoria Stodart, who is with the International Federation of the Red Cross and the lead for the Shelter and Settlements Cluster. I'd like to thank Jaime McGoldrick, who spoke in his capacity as the former humanitarian coordinator in Nepal. And I'd like to thank Dylan Winder with the DFID, who also gave a very rich, from a donor perspective point of view to this conversation. Most importantly, I would like to thank all of you colleagues from over 40 countries who followed this conversation. This webinar is recorded, will be downloaded. You will receive by email the PowerPoint presentation that was shared. I also want to know that the STAIT, the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Learning Mission on Preparedness to Nepal report will be ready soon, and we will also email it to all of you who have attended, and of course will be widely distributed to the community. So from all of us here, we'd like to thank you for attending this webinar, and this brings us to the end of this conversation. Have a great day.